A desperate millionaire awaits an international investor who promised to save his company from collapse. The visitor arrives early, bringing expensive wine to celebrate the partnership. When the millionaire arrives, the investor pours the wine. And just then, the cleaner's daughter bursts into the room, pretending to trip, deliberately spilling the wine on his suit, and whispers, "Sir, I'm sorry for the accident." He grows angry. But when she leans to his ear and murmurs, "I saw him putting something in your glass," the atmosphere turns deadly tense. The fine rain beat against the windshield of the luxury sedan, each drop an insistent reminder of the time Arthur Warren had lost. It was 4 in the afternoon on a grey Thursday, and he was, as always, running late. The New York City traffic crawled, indifferent to his urgency, a metallic, impatient mass that mirrored the knot in his stomach. He gripped the leather steering wheel, his knuckles white. The phone screen beside him flashed with email and meeting notifications, each one another brick in the wall he'd built around himself since Helena was gone. It was a wall made of work, of numbers, of acquisitions and mergers, a cold and inadequate substitute for the warmth of a family. He told himself it was to secure the future for Thomas, his 9-year-old son. But in the silence of the car, the truth haunted him. It was to escape the present, the empty apartment, the empty chair at the dinner table. A bitter guilt rose in his throat. He had promised Thomas he would be on time to pick him up from school, a small promise that now felt like it carried the weight of the world. Finally, the imposing, wrought-iron gates of Crestwood Academy appeared ahead, a symbol of the privilege he could offer his son, a privilege that, in that moment, felt utterly useless. Arthur double-parked, ignoring the angry honk from another parent, and his eyes scanned the courtyard for Thomas's brown hair and blue backpack. And then he saw him. His heart didn't just stop, it shattered. Near the marble fountain, Thomas was cornered. 3 older boys surrounded him, a circle of mockery and cruelty. One of them shoved Thomas's shoulder, who stumbled back, his glasses sliding down his nose. The muffled sound of their laughter cut through the car window and hit Arthur like a physical blow. He saw his son's face, streaked with silent tears, his small body hunched in a futile attempt to disappear. Other students walked by, some casting curious glances, most indifferent, hurrying to find their own parents. No one intervened, no one cared. A cold, primal fury seized Arthur. He unlocked the door, the blood pounding in his temples, ready to march over there and tear those boys apart with his bare hands. His wealth, his power, his influence, it all melted away into a single instinct: protect his child. But before his hand could push the door open, a tiny, unexpected figure entered the scene. It was a girl, maybe a year or 2 younger than Thomas, with clothes that were dirty and too big for her thin frame, and worn sneakers that barely protected her feet from the damp pavement. Arthur vaguely recognized her. She was the little girl who sometimes lingered near the gate, the one he occasionally gave a few dollars or a leftover snack from the car. She stopped between Thomas and the bullies, her skinny legs planted firmly on the ground. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, in a voice that was surprisingly loud and steady for her size, she yelled, the words slicing through the damp air and the general apathy. "Get away from him! He's my friend!" The boys, caught off guard, took a step back. They looked at the girl, at her ragged clothes and soot-stained face, and then at each other, confused. There was something in her posture, a complete absence of fear, a fierce determination in her dark eyes that disarmed them entirely. It wasn't the threat of an adult, but the courage of someone who had absolutely nothing to lose. Muttering something among themselves, they turned and scattered, intimidated not by force, but by a bravery they couldn't comprehend. Arthur remained frozen, his hands still on the door handle, his breath caught in his chest. He watched the girl turn to Thomas. She didn't say anything. She just reached out a small, grimy hand and, with her thumb, wiped a tear from his cheek. and Thomas, his shy, frightened son, looked at her and offered a small, trembling smile of gratitude. In that instant, the truth hit Arthur with the force of a tidal wave. All his money, all his power had not protected his son. But this small, unknown girl with nothing but her own courage had. Her words echoed in his mind, not as a shout, but as a devastating revelation. He's my friend. A friendship he, the father, had no idea existed. The sound of the car door closing seemed to echo in the now almost empty courtyard. Arthur walked toward them, each step heavy with a mixture of fury and shame. The light rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and the sky the color of lead. The girl, who he now saw was even smaller than he'd imagined, looked up at him with suspicion, her dark, watchful eyes assessing the potential threat a tall stranger in an expensive suit represented. Instinctively, she moved slightly forward, subtly placing herself between Arthur and Thomas, a tiny shield made of rags. The gesture, so subtle and so powerful, struck Arthur harder than the bully's shove. She was protecting his son from him, from his own father. Thomas, seeing his father approach, flinched slightly, as if expecting to be scolded for crying, for being weak. "Thomas, let's go home," Arthur said, his voice hoarser than he intended. He crouched down to be at the girl's eye level. "Thank you. You were very brave." She just nodded, her thin lips pressed into a serious line, and before he could say more, ask her name or where she lived, she turned and vanished down a side street, swallowed by the grey cityscape as quickly as she had appeared. The silence in the car on the way home was thick and uncomfortable. Arthur watched his son in the rearview mirror, his heart aching. He wanted to ask a million questions but didn't know where to start. How could he have been so blind? "Who is she, son?" he finally asked, his voice gentle. Thomas shrugged, his eyes fixed on the window. "Leah," he whispered. The name hung in the air, simple and unknown. "She's my friend." The simplicity of the statement was a verdict on Arthur's failure. His son's only friend was a girl who lived on the streets. "Why did you never tell me about the boys? About what happened today?" Thomas was silent for a long moment. "You're always busy," he said, not with accusation, but as a statement of fact. The sentence was a knife in his chest, twisting the guilt that was already consuming him. He had no defense. It was the truth. He wore his work like armor, but now he saw that the armor kept him from feeling what mattered most. When they arrived at the luxurious, silent penthouse, something remarkable happened. Instead of retreating to his room as he usually did, Thomas went to the living room, took out his sketchbook, and began to draw with a concentration Arthur hadn't seen in months. He was even humming a tuneless little song. There was a lightness to his shoulders, a spark in his eyes that wasn't there before. Arthur watched him from the doorway, perplexed. The scene of humiliation in the schoolyard should have left him devastated, but he seemed better, more confident. And then the realization hit him, cold and sharp. This change wasn't from today. This new confidence had been building for some time, nurtured by this secret friendship. If the friendship wasn't new, it meant the torment wasn't either. The incident he'd witnessed wasn't an isolated event. It was just the chapter he happened to have seen. Guilt morphed into a cold panic. How long had this been going on? Right under his nose, he approached slowly, sitting on the edge of the sofa. "Thomas," he began, his voice trembling, "this friendship with Leah, has it been for a long time?" Thomas looked up from his drawing, a surprisingly detailed sketch of a girl with a brave smile. "A few weeks," he said. Arthur took a deep breath, gathering the courage to ask the question he dreaded most. "And the other boys? How long have they been bothering you?" Thomas looked down at the paper, the pencil stopping in his hand. He hesitated, his lower lip trembling. Since Mom was gone. Time stopped. Years, not weeks or months, years of silent suffering that he, in his fog of work and grief, had been completely unable to see. The pain of the revelation was physical, a crushing weight on his chest. He couldn't fix this with a wire transfer or a call to his lawyers. That night, driven by a desperation he hadn't felt since he'd lost Helena, Arthur grabbed his car keys. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't stand still. He drove back to the neighborhood around the school, cruising slowly through the dark, damp streets. Under the yellow glare of a streetlight, in front of a closed bookstore, he saw her. Leah was huddled under the awning, shielded from the drizzle, but not for the reason he expected. In her lap, illuminated by the weak street lamp, was a thick, worn-out book, and her small eyes moved rapidly across the pages, absorbed in a world no one would imagine she could reach. Arthur parked a safe distance away, the engine off, and just watched. The image of that child, alone in the cold night, lost in a book, was so incongruous and heartbreaking that he felt a lump in his throat. Her clothes were damp, her tangled hair stuck to her forehead, but none of it seemed to bother her. Her entire universe was contained in those yellowed pages. He wondered what story held her so captivated, what adventure was carrying her away from the cold concrete and the indifference of the city. He stayed there for almost an hour, an invisible spectator, as she read with an intensity he rarely saw even in the most dedicated executives at his firm. Finally, with a yawn that shook her small frame, she carefully closed the book, placed it inside a plastic bag to protect it from the damp, and nestled into a doorway, using her tattered backpack as a pillow. Her vulnerability hit him full force. She was a child, alone. He fought the urge to get out of the car, to take her somewhere warm, to give her a meal. What would he say? How would he explain his presence there, lurking in the dark? Frightening her was the last thing he wanted to do. The next morning, guilt and restlessness drove him back to the same spot. Leah was gone. Instead, he found the bookstore's janitor sweeping the sidewalk. On impulse, Arthur got out of the car and approached the man. "Excuse me," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "I saw a little girl reading here last night. Do you know her?" The janitor, an old man with white hair and a weary face, leaned on his broom and sighed. "Ah, the little reader. Yeah, she shows up now and then. Smart little thing she is. Finds books in the trash that people toss from the donation bins. Reads anything, from romance novels to physics manuals. Saw her with one on botany once. I asked her why, and she told me she liked to know the names of the flowers that grow in the cracks of the sidewalk." He shook his head, a mix of admiration and sorrow in his eyes. "It's a shame, a mind like that, lost out here." The man's words confirmed Arthur's impression and deepened it. It wasn't just courage that girl possessed. It was a brilliance, a raw intelligence that bloomed in the harshest conditions, like the flowers in the cracks she liked to name. This discovery shook the foundations of his beliefs. Arthur, a man who valued education above all, who paid a fortune for his son to have access to the best teachers and resources, was confronted with the reality of a self-taught child learning from society's cast-offs. His worldview, compartmentalized into boxes of social status and opportunity, began to crumble. He had always equated intelligence and potential with environment, with upbringing, with access. Leah was living proof that he was wrong. Her poverty didn't define her ability, it only limited her opportunities. The image of her reading under the streetlight merged with the image of his son, crying in the schoolyard, and he understood that both children were victims of a system he, in a way, helped perpetuate. A system that valued appearance over substance, that insulated the privileged and ignored the needy. When he went to pick up Thomas from school that afternoon, he arrived early. He saw Leah sitting on a bench across the street, waiting. Thomas ran to meet her as soon as he came through the gate, his face lighting up. They didn't say much, but Thomas handed her the apple from his lunch and a small, colorfully covered book. Leah accepted it with a genuine smile, a flash of joy in her eyes that transformed her grimy face. Arthur watched the exchange from his car, his heart heavy. It was a pure, simple friendship based on a connection that transcended their vastly different realities. He wasn't the only one who noticed, however. Across the courtyard, he saw a group of impeccably dressed mothers looking toward the children. Their faces held not sympathy, but disapproval. They whispered among themselves, casting judgmental glances at the ragged girl and then at Thomas. One of them, the mother of one of the boys who had tormented his son, recognized him. She walked over to his car, her face a mask of feigned concern. "Arthur, darling," she began, her voice syrupy. "I don't mean to pry, but don't you think it's dangerous letting Thomas associate with that sort of person? For the safety and the reputation of the school, you know." The poisonous suggestion hung in the air, a veiled threat. The subtle but powerful social pressure was beginning to form, and Arthur realized that Leah's courage had solved one problem but created another, far larger and more insidious. He was being forced to choose a side, and whatever choice he made would have profound consequences. That sort of person. The words from Catherine, the bully's mother, echoed in Arthur's mind all the way home, acidic and revealing. She didn't see a brave, intelligent child. She saw only dirt, poverty, a threat to her pristine, protected world. Arthur had given a cold, evasive answer, but the seed of discord had been planted. He felt the other parents' eyes on him, judging him, questioning his fitness as a father for allowing such an association. Privilege, he realized bitterly, came with a set of unwritten rules, and he was on the verge of breaking them. The pressure wasn't just about reputation. It was a force aimed at isolating and excluding, at reinforcing the invisible barriers that separated their worlds. He looked at Thomas in the back seat, engrossed in the book Leah had lent him, a field guide to urban birds. His son's genuine joy, something he hadn't seen in so long, was worth more than the approval of all those people combined. Yet he knew the battle was just beginning. The following days turned into a social minefield. The whispers became formal complaints. First, an email from the Parent-Teacher Association, phrased in polite language, expressing concern over the presence of unauthorized individuals in the school's vicinity. Then, a call from the headmistress, Mrs. Caldwell, a woman whose spine seemed to be made of rules and regulations. "Mr. Warren, I understand the compassion," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "But the safety of our students is paramount. The constant presence of this girl is causing discomfort. Other parents are concerned about issues of hygiene, of improper influences." Arthur argued, defended his son's right to have friends regardless of their background. But his words hit a wall of prejudice disguised as institutional policy. He could feel the net closing in, the pressure mounting for him to do the sensible thing, the expected thing, discourage the friendship, restore order, keep the bubble intact. The confrontation with Thomas was inevitable. One night, after tucking his son in, Arthur sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Son, we need to talk about Leah," he began, hating the words before they even left his mouth. Thomas's body tensed under the covers. The headmistress and some of the parents, they don't want her hanging around the school. Thomas sat up abruptly, his eyes wide with fear and indignation. "But why? She didn't do anything wrong. She helped me." The simplicity of a child's logic was a mirror to the hypocritical complexity of adults. "I know, champ, I know. But they think she doesn't belong there." The word belong sounded hollow and cruel. Thomas hugged his knees, his face shutting down. "It's not fair," he whispered. "She's the only one who gets me. The others laugh because I like to read about bugs, and I'm not good at soccer. Leah doesn't. She taught me the names of 3 types of ants that live in the school garden. She's smarter than all of them." Thomas's revelation, the depth of the connection they shared, solidified Arthur's resolve. This was no longer about a casual friendship. It was about his son's emotional health. He could not, would not, take away the one person who made him feel seen and valued. The school, however, acted first. The next day, when Thomas ran to meet Leah on their usual bench, a school security guard stepped between them. "Sorry, kid, you can't stay here. Orders from the office." The man's voice was firm, but not unkind. Leah didn't argue. She just looked at Thomas, a look of sorrow and resignation that broke Arthur's heart as he watched from afar. She handed him a folded piece of paper and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Thomas stood frozen, the paper in his hand, looking smaller and more vulnerable than ever. The injustice was now official, institutionalized. Their friendship had been forbidden, not by a fight or a disagreement, but by a decree based on prejudice. When Thomas got into the car, he wasn't crying. His eyes were dry but filled with a cold anger that scared Arthur. He opened the note. It was a drawing. Two birds, one large and one small, flying together. Below it, in surprisingly neat handwriting, it said, "Meet me at the park, where the statues sleep." A friendship forced into hiding. Arthur gripped the steering wheel, the hostility of that privileged world, now feeling deeply personal. They weren't just pushing away a street kid, they were trying to break his son's spirit. Statuary Park, as the kids called it, was a forgotten refuge in the heart of the city. A small oasis of green where bronze figures of forgotten poets and generals slept under a canopy of old trees. It became Thomas and Leah's secret sanctuary. Arthur would drive them there after school, watching from a respectful distance as they explored, shared secrets and books, and simply existed in a world of their own, away from judging eyes. He saw his son blossom in those meetings. Thomas, once withdrawn and anxious, now spoke with enthusiasm, gesturing, laughing openly. Leah, in turn, seemed to allow herself to be a child. The constant seriousness on her face would dissolve, giving way to smiles and a vibrant curiosity about the world. They were just two kids being friends. A scene so natural and pure, it made the school's ban all the more grotesque. Arthur felt a bitter peace watching them together, a happiness haunted by the knowledge that this was fragile, temporary. The society that had banished them would not give up so easily. The calm, as he feared, was brief. A week into the secret park meetings, he received an official letter, not from the school, but from Child Protective Services. The letter, written in cold, bureaucratic language, informed him that an anonymous complaint had been filed regarding the welfare of Thomas Warren. It alleged he was being exposed to at-risk environments and associations by his legal guardian. A visit from a social worker was scheduled. The threat was no longer veiled. It was direct and terrifying. They were no longer attacking the friendship. They were attacking his fatherhood, his custody. Panic seized him with icy claws. The same community that allowed their children to be cruel bullies was now accusing him of being an unfit father for encouraging kindness. The hypocrisy was suffocating. He remembered Catherine's face, her false concern. He had no doubt who was behind the complaint. It was an escalation, an attempt to use the system against him, to punish him for defying their norms. He spent the night sleepless, pacing his silent apartment, the lit-up city skyline seeming to mock his powerlessness, his financial empire, his network of contacts. None of it felt useful now. How could he fight such an insidious accusation? How could he prove that a friendship with a homeless girl was, in fact, the healthiest thing that had happened to his son in years? He thought of hiring the best lawyers, of using his influence to crush the complaint. But he knew that would only confirm the narrative they were trying to create. The arrogant millionaire who thinks he's above the rules. He needed something more. He needed to understand who Leah was, where she came from. Her vulnerability was the weak point in his defense. To protect her and himself, he needed to know her story. The next day, instead of going to his office, he went looking for her, not at the park, but in the places he imagined she frequented, public libraries, soup kitchens, the alleys behind restaurants. It was a frustrating, humbling search. He, Arthur Warren, used to having the world at his beck and call, was lost in the underbelly of the city he only knew from his glass tower. Finally, at a small daytime shelter, a volunteer recognized her from his description. Leah, yes, a bright girl, but very private, doesn't trust anyone. The woman hesitated, then looked at him closely. If you really want to help her, you need to know the truth. She's not in the system, not officially. Her parents, they were gone about 2 years ago. A bus accident, coming back from upstate. No one ever came looking for her. She's been surviving on her own ever since, by staying invisible. If social services finds her, she'll go to a group home. And she's terrified of those places. The revelation left him breathless. 2 years, alone. An orphan who had slipped through the cracks of the system, surviving on her own intelligence and resilience. The urgency of his situation became desperate. This was no longer just about protecting a friendship. It was about saving a child. And the CPS investigation he so feared could be the very force that would tear her from his life and throw her into an impersonal, frightening system. He was trapped, where every move to protect his son could inadvertently condemn the girl who had saved him. The knowledge that Leah was an orphan living completely off the grid changed everything. The threat from Child Protective Services now had a double edge. It could take Thomas from him and, simultaneously, swallow Leah into a system that she, for reasons he didn't yet fully understand, deeply feared. Arthur felt like he was walking a razor's edge. The visit from the social worker, a woman named Ms. Evans, was tense. She was professional, her eyes taking in every detail of the immaculate apartment, every interaction between father and son. Arthur tried to be transparent, explaining the bullying situation and how the friendship with Leah had been beneficial for Thomas's emotional recovery. He omitted, however, what he'd discovered about her being an orphan, fearing the revelation would trigger the very thing he wanted to avoid. Ms. Evans listened patiently, making notes on her clipboard. "I understand your perspective, Mr. Warren," she said at the end, her voice neutral, "but the complaint is a serious one. Your son's association with an unaccompanied minor raises questions of safety and supervision. We will need to investigate further." Her words, though calm, were a clear warning. He was under scrutiny. The external pressure intensified, but the biggest change was happening within Thomas. The secret friendship, the need to protect Leah, had awakened a strength in him that Arthur had never seen. He was no longer the boy who shrank in corners. One day at the park, as Leah read to him from a book on astronomy, Thomas interrupted her. "Leah, I don't want to hide anymore. It's not fair to you." Leah put the book down, her expression worried. "But Thomas, they'll send me away, to a bad place." "I won't let them," Thomas said, his voice firm, echoing the determination she had shown him. "My dad will figure it out. He's good at fixing problems." Arthur, overhearing the conversation from a distance, felt a mix of pride and panic. His son's faith in his ability to fix problems was both moving and crushing. He, who settled multi-billion-dollar mergers with a phone call, felt utterly lost on how to solve this human dilemma. The situation came to a head a few days later, tipped off by the ongoing investigation. City officers, accompanied by a different social worker than Mrs. Evans, approached Leah while she was alone, reading on a park bench. It was a routine check on child vagrancy, likely instigated by the same forces that had reported him. They questioned her about her parents, where she lived, true to her survival instinct. Leah said nothing, but the fear in her eyes was plain. One of the officers, growing impatient, spoke of taking her to a temporary shelter until her situation was clarified. That was enough. That evening, Leah didn't show up at the park, nor the next. Panic began to set in. Arthur and Thomas went back to the park every afternoon, waiting, the silence growing heavier each time. Thomas, who had become so talkative and confident, regressed. The light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a constant anxiety. He barely ate, barely slept. She left because of me. "Dad," he whispered one night, his face pale. "They scared her away. It's my fault." Watching his son unravel was torture. Leah's absence had created a vacuum that all of Arthur's love and wealth could not fill. Their friendship wasn't just a comfort, it was a lifeline for them both. Desperate, Arthur mobilized his resources. He quietly hired a private investigator, a former cop, to find an 8-year-old girl in a city of millions, a nearly impossible task. The days dragged on into a week of anguish. The investigator called with disheartening reports, no sign of her in the usual spots. It was as if she'd become a ghost, just as she had for the past 2 years. Thomas's regression was alarming. He refused to go to school, afraid to face the bullies without his protector. He spent hours at the window, staring down at the street, hoping for a glimpse of tangled hair and worn sneakers. The emotional dependency the two children had developed on one another was now painfully clear. The forced separation was breaking his son's spirit, and Arthur realized with growing terror that the threat to his custody was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. His son was, in fact, suffering, not because of the friendship, but because of its cruel absence. He had to find her, not just for her sake, but to save Thomas. On the 7th day of the search, the investigator called with unexpected news, a sliver of hope that would change the course of everything. He hadn't found her, but he'd found something connected to her. An old file in a county clerk's office in a small town upstate. A file that spoke of a will and a small property left in the name of Leah Martins by her parents. A will that was being contested. The girl he thought had nothing, in fact, had a home. A home that greedy, distant relatives were trying to steal. The investigator's revelation was like a flash of light in a dark tunnel. Leah wasn't just a nameless, pastless girl. She had roots, an identity, and most importantly, a right. The existence of an inheritance, however modest, transformed her situation from a social services case into a complex legal dispute. Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline replace his despair. Here was something he understood, a battlefield where his skills and resources could make a difference. Lawyers, property disputes, litigation. This was his world. The girl who had taught him about courage now needed the kind of protection only he could offer. The irony was not lost on him. He, who had felt powerless, now had a clear path, a way to fight for her that involved not just emotion but strategy. The information gave him not only hope, but a new, powerful motivation. Protecting Leah was no longer just an act of compassion, it was a matter of justice. He immediately put his legal team to work. Within hours, they had the full picture. Leah's parents, simple laborers, had saved their whole lives to buy a small piece of land with a modest house in their hometown, a place they dreamed of renovating for their retirement. After the accident, distant cousins, the only known relatives, had emerged with a claim on the property, arguing that a missing and presumably unfit child could not inherit. They wanted to sell the land quickly to a local real estate developer. The case was crawling through the slow bureaucracy of a small town, but Leah's absence made their victory almost certain. Hiding somewhere in the city, Leah likely carried the documents that proved her identity. The only real obstacle to her relatives, greed, her invisibility, which had been her survival tool, was now the weapon her relatives were using against her. While his lawyers dove into the paperwork, Arthur focused on the search. The new information provided clues. If Leah knew about the inheritance, she might be trying to get back to her hometown, or perhaps she was hiding near a place that reminded her of her parents. The investigator, now with a full name and a story to follow, focused the search on bus terminals and public libraries with access to maps and travel information. Thomas, upon hearing the news, seemed to reignite. The idea that Leah had a home, a place that was hers, gave him something concrete to hold on to. "We have to find her, Dad," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "We have to help her get her house back." The shared mission united them like never before. For the first time, they weren't just a father and son suffering separately, but a team with a purpose. The break came 3 days later. The investigator called, his voice excited. "I've got her. Or rather, a librarian has." Leah, using a public computer in a library on the other side of the city, had been looking up bus routes to upstate New York. The librarian, an observant woman who'd been given the search flyer, recognized her. She didn't confront her, but called the number on the flyer. Leah was still there. Arthur felt his heart leap into his throat. "Don't lose her. We're on our way." He and Thomas rushed to the car, the silence filled with a hopeful tension. When they arrived at the library, they saw her through the plate glass window, small and focused on the computer screen. Arthur took a deep breath, steeling himself. He knew the approach had to be careful. She was a frightened child, on the run from any figure of authority. He couldn't fail. He had Thomas go in first. Seeing him might calm her. Thomas opened the library door and walked slowly toward the computer station. "Leah," he called softly. She whipped around, her eyes widening in surprise and fear. She immediately started gathering her few belongings, ready to bolt. "No, wait," Thomas said, holding out a hand. "We're not going to hurt you. My dad's here. He wants to help." "For real?" Leah hesitated, her gaze flickering between Thomas and the door. Arthur entered slowly, keeping his hands visible, his expression as gentle as he could muster. "Leah," he said, his voice calm, "we know about your house. We know about the land your parents left for you. We're not here to take you to a shelter. We're here to help you fight for what's yours." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but not of fear. It was the relief of finally being seen, of having her secret burden acknowledged. For the first time since he'd met her, she didn't look like a hardened survivor, but just a tired child who had been carrying a weight far too great. She looked at Thomas, then at Arthur, and in a gesture of complete and absolute trust, she pulled a worn plastic envelope from inside her jacket. Inside, yellowed and folded, were her documents, her birth certificate, and the deed to the property, the key to her future. Holding that plastic envelope felt more significant to Arthur than closing any multi-million-dollar deal. It was a testament to Leah's resilience and a symbol of the trust she was placing in him. In the car on the way home, a different kind of silence settled in. Not the tense quiet of before, but one of exhaustion and relief. Leah sat in the back next to Thomas, huddled against the door as if trying to take up as little space as possible. For the first time, she was inside the luxury car, crossing the threshold into a world she had only ever observed from the outside. Thomas, sensing her discomfort, quietly offered her a small toy robot he always carried in his pocket. Leah examined it with curiosity, her small fingers tracing the plastic seams, and a tiny smile touched her lips. It was a silent bridge between two universes, a gesture of normalcy in an extraordinary situation. When they arrived at the penthouse, the sheer scale of the contrast hit her. Leah stopped at the entrance to the living room, her wide eyes taking in the high ceilings, the panoramic windows showcasing the city as a carpet of lights, and the elegant furniture. To her, it must have looked like a palace from another planet. Marta, the family's longtime housekeeper, a warm-hearted woman who had helped raise Thomas, approached with a kind smile. "Welcome, dear. You must be hungry. I've made some warm soup." Leah took a step back, wary, unaccustomed to such open kindness. But Marta, with the wisdom of someone who understands children, simply placed the bowl on a small table and moved away, giving her space. It was Thomas who coaxed her forward. He took her hand and led her to the sofa. "It's okay to eat. Marta's soup is the best." Watching the two of them eat together, Arthur felt a pang of something that resembled a real family, a feeling he hadn't had since Helena's death. Leah's presence in the house however temporary, began to fill the emptiness. She was quiet and observant, moving through the apartment like a small ghost. But gradually, her natural curiosity won out over her shyness. She discovered Arthur's library, and her eyes lit up at the sight of the floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books. He found her one afternoon sitting on the floor, completely absorbed in an illustrated encyclopedia of the human body. "I like to know how things work on the inside," she explained, without looking up from the page. Arthur started spending more time at home, cancelling meetings and delegating tasks. He would sit with them as they did homework, or in Leah's case, as she devoured books far beyond her grade level. He learned about constellations, about the life cycle of butterflies, about dormant volcanoes. All through her relentless questions and the answers they looked up together, he was reconnecting not just with his son, but with a world of wonder and discovery that his work had made him forget. While domestic life found a new, fragile equilibrium, the legal battle intensified. Arthur's lawyers filed an immediate motion to contest the relatives' claim and petition for temporary guardianship for him, arguing it was in the child's best interest. The reaction from the other side was swift and vicious. They countersued, not just in court, but in the court of public opinion. The story was leaked to a local gossip blog. "Millionaire tries to seize orphan's inheritance to cover up neglect of own son." The narrative was twisted and poisonous, painting Arthur as a manipulator and Leah as a pawn. The news spread like wildfire through the small, interconnected world of the city's elite. The pressure from the school, which had subsided, returned in full force. The headmistress, Mrs. Caldwell, called again, her voice frigid. "Mr. Warren, this situation has become untenable. The school's name is being associated with a scandal. We need you to take definitive action." The definitive action, she implied, was clear. Distance yourself from the girl, drop the fight, get back in your gilded box. The slander, however, had an unexpected effect. It exposed the hypocrisy of his accusers in a way Arthur hadn't anticipated. One night, while reading the malicious online comments, he found something that made him pause. One of his lawyers had alerted him to a connection. He searched the names. The real estate developer that wanted to buy Leah's land was partially funded by an investment consortium, and one of the primary investors in that consortium was the husband of Catherine, the very woman leading the smear campaign against him at the school. This wasn't just about social prejudice. There was a direct financial motive to discrediting him and ensuring Leah lost her inheritance. The fight wasn't just about morality. It was about greed. The same greed that allowed their children to bully a sensitive boy was the greed trying to steal an orphan's only birthright. Arthur's rage crystallized into a cold, steel-like resolve. They had made a mistake. They had underestimated how far he would go to protect not one, but two children, and they had just given him the weapon he needed to fight back. The discovery of Catherine and her husband's financial connection to Leah's land was the missing piece of the puzzle. The persecution wasn't just snobbery, it was a calculated, cruel business strategy. Arthur felt a cold rage settle over him. They were using their children's bullying, the school's structure, and the community's prejudice as tools to intimidate him and ultimately profit from a child's misfortune. The hypocrisy was abyssal. The same people accusing him of exposing his son to bad influences were, in fact, orchestrating cruelty and attempting to commit fraud. The outrage gave Arthur a new focus. He was no longer on the defensive, reacting to their attacks. Now, he had a clear target. He instructed his lawyers and investigators to dig deep, to follow every transaction, every email, every phone call. "I want everything," he said on a call, his voice low and dangerous. "Expose every bit of rot you find." While the investigation proceeded behind the scenes, Arthur made a bold decision. He realized that fighting only in the courts wasn't enough. The battle for public opinion, which he had once disdained, was crucial. He had to change the narrative, and to do that, he needed the truth. His, Thomas's, and most importantly, Leah's. One evening, he sat down with the two children in the living room. The atmosphere was serious. "We need to talk about what's happening," he began. "People are saying bad things about us, about our family." He explained, in simple terms they could understand, about the fight for Leah's house and how some people from school were trying to stop them from helping. Thomas listened with a furrowed brow, his jaw tight. Leah, as always, listened in silence, absorbing every word. "Those people, the parents of the boys who hurt you, Thomas, are the same ones who want Leah's house," Arthur continued, watching their reactions. "They're lying so that we'll give up." He saw understanding spark in Thomas's eyes. The injustice was no longer an abstract concept. It had a face, the face of his tormentors and their parents. "That's evil," Thomas whispered. Arthur nodded. "It is. And that's why we can't hide anymore. We need to tell our story." He looked at Leah, the hardest part of the conversation. "Leah, this means people will know about you living alone. It's going to be hard and maybe scary, but it's the only way we can show them the truth." Leah was silent for a long time, her eyes fixed on a distant point. Arthur held his breath, knowing he wouldn't force her. The choice had to be hers. Finally, she lifted her chin, a spark of the fierce determination he'd seen in the schoolyard glowing in her eyes. "They can't hurt Thomas anymore," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "If telling the truth will stop it, then I'll tell it." With Leah's blessing, Arthur acted. He contacted a respected investigative journalist, known for her integrity and her reporting on social issues. He didn't give her a sensational, exclusive interview. Instead, he gave her access to his lawyers, to the documents on the land dispute, to the proof of the financial connection, and, very carefully, he arranged for the journalist to meet the children with a child psychologist present to ensure their well-being. It wasn't a formal interview. It was a conversation. The journalist, a kind, perceptive woman named Clara, simply listened. She listened as Thomas described, in a trembling but brave voice, the years of silent bullying. And she listened as Leah told her story, not as a victim, but as a survivor, describing how books were her companions and how her friendship with Thomas made her feel less alone. The report was published the following Sunday on the front page of a major newspaper. It wasn't sensationalist. It was a powerful, detailed account of the hypocrisy of a privileged community, the cruelty of institutionalized bullying, and the unlikely friendship that blossomed in the midst of it. The story exposed the greed behind the land dispute and painted a devastating portrait of parents who, while preaching about safety and propriety, allowed their own children to be agents of torment. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The tide of public opinion turned completely. The school was flooded with calls from furious parents, not at Arthur, but at the administration and the implicated families. Child Protective Services, now under a media spotlight, reassessed its position. The anonymous complaint began to look exactly like what it was, a weapon in a campaign of harassment. The battle was far from over, but Arthur had won a crucial round. He had taken the fight out of the shadows and into the uncomfortable glare of the truth. And at that moment, something even more unexpected happened. Someone from Leah's past, someone she thought she had lost forever, read the report and recognized her parents' name. An old neighbor and her mother's best friend who had moved from the small town years ago and lost touch, saw the photo of the determined-eyed little girl and knew, with a certainty that shook her heart, that she had to do something. Clara's report resonated through the city like a stone dropped in a still pond. The ripples reached every corner of Arthur's world. His office phone rang off the hook, but instead of the angry calls from before, they were messages of support from strangers, from other parents disgusted by the exposed hypocrisy. and even from a few business contacts who commended him on his integrity. The silence from Catherine and her allies was deafening. They had gone to ground, retreating into the shadows, undoubtedly planning their next move, but for now they were wounded. Arthur felt a grim satisfaction, but knew the war wasn't won. The legal battle for Leah's guardianship and his own reputation as a father still loomed. It was in the midst of this tense calm that the call that would change everything came. It was Clara, the journalist. "Arthur, I have something for you, something important. A woman called me after reading the piece. Her name is Isabel. She says she was Leah's mother's best friend." Arthur's heart leaped, a mix of hope and skepticism. So many things could be a setup. It could be a scam, someone trying to take advantage of the situation. "Do you believe her?" he asked, his voice controlled. "I do," Clara said with conviction. She sobbed on the phone for 10 minutes. She told me details about Leah's childhood, about the nickname her mother used, things no one could know. She moved to the city a few years ago, before the accident, and lost touch. She's beside herself with guilt and desperate to help. She wants to meet you. They arranged to meet the next afternoon at a discreet cafe far from their usual neighborhoods. Arthur decided to go alone first. He needed to vet this woman, to protect Leah from any further disappointment. Isabel was a woman in her early 50s, with a kind face etched with worry lines and a warm smile that didn't quite reach her sad eyes. She stood as Arthur approached the table, her hands twisting a paper napkin. "Mr. Warren," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for finding her. I looked for her after I heard about the accident, but no one knew where she'd gone." The tears she'd been holding back finally fell. She told stories of Laura, Leah's mother, of their friendship since childhood, of the dreams they'd shared. Laura and her husband, they loved that girl more than anything, Isabel said, her voice filled with a genuine ache. That piece of land wasn't about money. It was Leah's future. They were going to build a house with a big garden for her to run in, with a swing and a tree, to know that those vultures are trying to steal it from her. She couldn't finish the sentence. Arthur listened, his skepticism dissolving with every word, every shared memory that painted a vivid picture of the family Leah had lost. Isabel was not a threat. She was a blessing, a living witness to the love that had surrounded Leah, a voice from the past who could secure her future. "I'll testify," she said firmly, wiping her eyes. "I will tell the judge who Leah's parents were and what they wanted for her. And I will tell them who that little girl's heart belongs to." Arthur felt a wave of relief so intense it left him momentarily speechless. Isabel was more than a witness. She was a connection, a link to Leah's roots. But at the same time, a new worry surfaced. How would Leah react to this? The girl was just beginning to build a new sense of stability, of belonging, with him and Thomas. The arrival of someone from a painful past could be deeply destabilizing. When Arthur got home that night, he found Thomas and Leah sitting together on the living room rug, building a fantastic city out of wooden blocks. The scene was so peaceful, so normal, it made his heart ache. They had created their own safe little world here, a refuge from the storm outside. He hated to be the one to bring news that might shatter that peace. He took a deep breath, the weight of his responsibility heavy on his shoulders. "Leah," he called softly. They both looked up at him, their play interrupted. "Can we talk for a minute? I have to tell you something. I met someone today, a friend of your mother's." Leah stared at him, the open, trusting expression he'd grown to love, completely unaware of the news that was about to shake the foundations of her small, newly rebuilt world. Arthur's words hung in the air, displacing all the oxygen in the room. Leah went still, the small wooden block forgotten in her hand. The world of colorful blocks on the rug, the fantastic city they had built, seemed to crumble in an instant. Her face, which moments before had been open and animated, became an expressionless mask. A defense mechanism honed over 2 years of survival. She didn't ask the name, didn't ask how. She just shut down, like a night-blooming flower recoiling from the touch of light. Thomas, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere, reached over and covered Leah's hand with his own. It was a small, instinctive gesture of pure solidarity. "It's okay," he whispered to her. But the look he gave his father was a mixture of confusion and pleading. Arthur knew he was treading on sacred, fragile ground. "Her name is Isabel," he said, his voice as gentle as possible. "She loved you very much, Leah. She wants to see you." Leah remained silent, her gaze lost, traveling to a place no one else in the room could reach. The meeting was set for the next day, at the apartment. Arthur felt it would be a safer, more controlled environment for Leah. When Isabel arrived, she carried with her not just a purse, but the weight of years of unspoken grief. Upon seeing Leah standing next to Thomas by the window, Isabel's eyes filled with tears. It was a torrent of love, guilt, and longing that left her momentarily speechless. She didn't rush to embrace her. Instead, she sat on the sofa at a respectful distance. "Hello, my little star," she said, using the nickname Leah's mother had used. The words hit Leah, who flinched visibly. Isabel began to talk, not about the accident, not about the pain, but about the good things. About picnics in the country, about the smell of her mother's apple crumble, about the lullaby she sang every night. As she spoke, Isabel started to hum the melody softly, an almost unconscious sound. It was the hum that broke through, the simple, familiar tune, the floodgates of Leah's memory, so carefully sealed for 2 years, burst open. A single tear tracked a path down her cheek, followed by another and another. And then, for the first time, she spoke to Isabel. "Do you remember the swing?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse in speaking of that time. Arthur and Thomas watched from a distance, feeling like intruders in a profoundly personal moment. Arthur felt an immense joy for Leah, for this connection to her past being restored, and underneath it, an irrational pang of fear, the fear of becoming redundant, that Leah, now with a piece of her old life back, wouldn't need him anymore. It was a selfish thought, and he pushed it away with shame. Leah's healing was all that mattered. Isabel's visits became a daily routine, gentle sessions of remembrance that helped Leah process her grief, to reconnect with who she was before she became merely a survivor. Isabel's presence also strengthened the legal case immensely. She was the perfect character witness, the personification of the life Leah deserved to have back. Catherine and her allies were cornered, public opinion was against them, and Arthur's legal case was becoming ironclad. Arthur began to feel, for the first time, a sense of optimism. That's when the final blow came, more cruel and devastating than anything they had done before. The call was from Mrs. Caldwell, the head mistress. Her voice, however, held no concern or even anger. There was a note of cold, satisfied triumph in it. "Mr. Warren, I regret to inform you that there has been a very serious incident at the school," she began. "A valuable necklace was stolen from the locker of Catherine Drummond's daughter, and several student witnesses saw the girl, Leah, loitering in the hallways at lunchtime, in an area where she was not supposed to be. The accusation was absurd, fabricated. Leah hadn't been to the school in weeks, but logic didn't matter. It was a perfect trap. The word of a street kid against several students from respectable families, a setup orchestrated to paint Leah not as a victim, but as a delinquent. Catherine is seriously considering pressing charges, the headmistress concluded. Arthur hung up the phone, the blood freezing in his veins. He looked into the living room, where Leah was laughing at something Isabel had told her. The innocence of that scene contrasted brutally with the malice of the accusation. He understood their strategy with terrifying clarity. They were no longer trying to push her away. They were trying to destroy her, to brand her with a crime, to ensure that no judge would ever deem her fit for a home, let alone an inheritance. The accusation of theft hung in the air like a toxic smoke, threatening to choke all the hope they had built. Arthur felt a surge of fury so intense it left him trembling. It was a calculated act of evil, a desperate move by people who, cornered by the truth, resorted to the vilest of lies. He looked at Leah, who had stopped laughing and was now watching him with her perceptive eyes, sensing the change in the atmosphere. How could he tell her this? How could he introduce such filth into the small sanctuary they had created? He didn't have to. His phone rang again. It was his lawyer, his voice urgent. "Arthur, things are moving fast. The Drummond family has filed a police report. They're using it to file an emergency motion in the custody hearing, claiming Leah is a dangerous, delinquent influence. The hearing has been moved up to tomorrow. The timeline, which should have given them weeks to prepare, had been compressed to less than 24 hours. The trap had been sprung. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but a glance at Thomas's face, pale and frightened beside him, anchored him. He could not fall apart. He was the adult, the protector. He had to fight. "Get everything we have together," he told the lawyer, his voice firm. The proof of their financial interest, the testimonies about the bullying, the journalist's report, everything. After hanging up, he knelt in front of the two children and Isabel. "They are lying about Leah. They are saying she took something that wasn't hers. And tomorrow, we have to go to a place, a courtroom, and tell the judge the truth." Leah's eyes widened, but this time, it wasn't just fear. It was outrage. The same spark of injustice that had made her defend Thomas in the schoolyard now burned for herself. "But I didn't do it," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I wasn't even there." "I know," Arthur said, "and we are going to prove it, but it's going to be hard. They will try to scare us." He looked at Thomas. "And you, champ, you might have to speak. You might have to tell the judge about your friends and about how Leah helped you." The thought of testifying in public, of facing not just the judge, but likely the parents of his tormentors, made Thomas shrink back. The fear he had fought so hard to overcome returned in a rush. Panic filled his eyes. He looked at Leah, at the injustice being done to his friend, the only one who had ever stood up for him. And then, something inside him shifted. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but something else grew stronger. Loyalty, love for his friend. He lifted his chin, a perfect imitation of Leah's own gesture. "I'll talk," he said. "I'll tell them everything." That night was the longest of Arthur's life. There was no sleep, only strategy, preparation, and quiet talks. He, his lawyer, Isabel, and the children sat around the dining table, not as a legal team, but as a family preparing for the fight of their lives. The courtroom the next morning was a cold, intimidating place. Dark wood paneling, high ceilings, and an oppressive silence. Across the room, Catherine and her husband sat with their lawyer, their faces impassive masks of righteousness. Other parents from the school were there, whispering, their gazes like small stones. The judge, a stern-looking man, heard from the Drummonds' lawyers first. They painted a convincing, though entirely false, picture of an out-of-control street child, a thief who posed a danger to the school's orderly community. They brought forth witnesses, the children of the very parents leading the campaign, who recited coached testimonies about seeing Leah near the lockers. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Arthur could feel the weight of systemic prejudice tilting against them. It was easy to believe their version. It was the narrative society expected. Then it was their turn. Arthur's lawyer methodically dismantled the financial accusations, but it was one word against another. Isabel gave a moving testimony about Leah's family, but that spoke to the past, not the present charge. The turning point, the climax of their entire journey, rested on the shoulders of a 9-year-old boy. Thomas was called to the stand. He walked to the witness chair, his legs trembling. He looked out at the gallery, at the faces of the boys who had tormented him, now sitting beside their parents. He looked at Leah, who watched him with her heart in her eyes. The opposing lawyer began his cross-examination, his voice condescending. "So, Thomas, you want the judge to believe that this girl, whom you barely know, is some kind of angel?" Thomas's voice was a barely audible whisper when he answered, "She's my best friend." The room fell completely silent. He took a deep breath, looked directly at the judge, and the story began to pour out. Not the story of the accusation, but his story. The story of years of loneliness, of fear, of being pushed and ridiculed while adults looked the other way. And then he spoke of Leah, of how she stood up for him when no one else would, of how she taught him the names of the stars. "She wouldn't steal anything," he said, his voice gaining strength, echoing in the silent room. "She gave me the one thing I needed and didn't have. She gave me courage." And then he looked directly at Catherine. "And your son, he lies. He told me his dad said they were going to get Leah's house and that I had to stay away from her. He said if I didn't, they would do something to make her disappear for good." Their castle of lies had just crumbled. Thomas's words fell into the courtroom silence with the weight of undeniable truth. The accusation, so carefully built on prejudice and lies, fractured under the force of a child's honesty. Catherine Drummond went pale, her face a mask of shock and fury at being exposed by a 9-year-old boy. Her lawyer shot to his feet to object, but the judge waved him silent, his eyes locked on Thomas and then, with new understanding, on the party across the aisle. Thomas's testimony, combined with the evidence Arthur's lawyer had presented about the Drummonds' financial interest in the property, painted a complete and devastating picture of conspiracy and cruelty. The case, which for a moment had seemed poised to condemn Leah, now turned against her accusers. The judge, seeing the truth clearly, ended the session abruptly, announcing he would deliver his decision the next day. But the verdict was already written on the defeated faces of Catherine and her husband. That same day, the resolution began to unfold outside the courtroom. The school, facing a scandal of epic proportions and the wrath of dozens of other parents who now saw the truth, moved swiftly. Mrs. Caldwell was suspended, and an internal investigation was opened into the culture of bullying that had been allowed to flourish under her watch. The families involved in the setup, including the Drummonds, withdrew their children from the institution, preferring flight to the humiliation of facing the community they had deceived. For Arthur, the sweetest victory was not legal, but personal. Leaving the courthouse, Thomas, who had trembled with fear on his way in, walked with his shoulders back, his head held high. He had not only defended his friend, he had defended himself, finding his own voice in the process. The shy, frightened boy had transformed, right before his eyes, into a brave young man of integrity. The next day, the judge's decision was a formality, but a powerful one. He not only threw out all charges against Leah, but sternly rebuked the Drummonds for their malicious attempt to manipulate the judicial system. He granted Arthur temporary guardianship of Leah, praising his dedication to protecting the well-being of both children, and most importantly, he issued a court order protecting Leah's inheritance from any further claims, ensuring her parents' dream would be preserved until she was of age to decide its future. The legal and social battle was won. Each character's narrative arc found its resolution. Leah, the girl who was invisible, was now seen and protected, her identity and future secure. Thomas, the boy who was a victim, had found his strength and become a hero in his own right. And Arthur, the father who used money as a substitute for presence, had learned the true meaning of protection and family. He realized his greatest acquisition was not his business empire, but the small, unlikely family he had formed. That night, the apartment wasn't silent. It was filled with life. Isabel was in the kitchen with Marta, the two women laughing and sharing stories. Thomas and Leah were in the living room, not building fantasy cities, but sketching plans for the garden at Leah's house, imagining where the swing would go. Arthur watched it all, his heart filled with a peace he hadn't felt in years. He walked over to the children and sat on the floor with them. "I have a proposal for you," he said. "Your school. I don't think it's the right place for brave, smart people like you. What do you think about us finding a new place? A place where being different is a good thing." The eyes of Thomas and Leah lit up with the same spark of hope. The decision to move Thomas from his school and enroll Leah for the first time was the final step in leaving the past behind and embracing the future they would build together. The central conflict was resolved, not just with a legal victory, but with profound emotional healing. The wounds of bullying, loss, and loneliness were beginning to scar over, replaced by the promise of a new beginning. Together, justice had prevailed, not only in the courts, but in the hearts of a family forged in adversity. 7 weeks after that grey, life-altering afternoon, the spring sun streamed through the windows of a different house. It was not the luxury penthouse overlooking the city, but a spacious home with a large yard in a quieter, more diverse neighborhood. Arthur had sold the apartment, a symbolic act of leaving behind the life of isolation he had built. This new house was a home, not a fortress. The sound of children's laughter echoed from the garden, where Thomas and Leah, now officially siblings under Arthur's legal guardianship, were testing the strength of a new swing hanging from a sturdy oak tree. The transformation was complete and visible. Thomas no longer wore his slumped shoulders like a shield. He moved with the confidence of someone who knows his own worth. Leah, dressed in bright, comfortable clothes, no longer had the haunted look of a survivor. Her eyes shone with the security of belonging. Arthur watched them from the porch, a cup of coffee in his hands. Isabel was beside him. She had become a constant, loving presence in their lives, an honorary grandmother who filled the house with the smell of baking and stories of the past. She was Leah's living bridge to her roots, ensuring the memory of her parents was never forgotten. Together, they had formed an unlikely family, stitched together with threads of grief, courage, and unconditional love. Leah's inheritance was safe, managed by a trust Arthur had established, growing until she was ready for it. The small house upstate was maintained, not as an asset to be sold, but as a shrine of memory, a place they could travel to connect with her past. The most profound change, however, was within Arthur. He had restructured his professional life, delegating most of his daily responsibilities to focus on what truly mattered. His new project was not a corporate takeover, but a foundation established in honor of Leah and her parents. The Apex Opportunity Project, ironically using a word similar to the school that had rejected them, provided scholarships and educational programs for vulnerable children. The project's director was Leah. Not officially, of course, but she was its inspiration. On Saturdays, they would go together to shelters and community centers. Leah, with her encyclopedic intelligence and hard-won empathy, taught other children how to read, how to stand up for themselves, how to find their voice. The girl once cast off by society was now a leader, empowering others to overcome the same barriers she had faced. The final scene unfolds on a sunny Saturday afternoon in the yard of a community center. Arthur's Foundation is inaugurating a small outdoor library filled with donated books. Leah is at the center of a circle of children, reading aloud, her voice clear and confident. Thomas is beside her, helping a smaller child sound out a difficult word. Arthur watches from a distance, not as a millionaire benefactor, but simply as a father, filled with a pride that warmed his soul. He had finally understood that fatherhood wasn't about giving your child the world money could buy, but about creating a world where kindness and courage were the greatest treasures. The gilded gates that once symbolized exclusion and separated him from his son's pain had been metaphorically melted down and reforged into bridges of opportunity. He had learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of his life. True protection comes not from wealth, but from presence. Family is defined not by blood, but by choice and love. And true success is measured not by social status, but by the ability to see the value in every human being, especially those society casts away. The girl who had nothing but courage had not only saved his son from bullies, but had saved the father from himself, teaching him that a real family, no matter how it's formed, will always find a way to protect its own.